This is the world's most confusing diagram for students, well, one of the world's most confusing. So the thing to remember is when lines cross, pressure changes have occurred. So if we start here, this point here is where the pressure starts to go up in the ventricle.
Yeah.
Yep. So when the pressure goes up in the ventricle, it's because it's contracting.
Yeah.
So when the line crosses between the ventricle and the atrium, then at that point you've got the atrium, you've got the valve, you've got the ventricle, you've got the valve, and then you've got the aorta. So when the lines cross, which is here, then at that point the pressure in the ventricle is greater than the pressure in the atrium, so blood is going to be pushed back towards the atrium, which is going to push that valve closed. So this point here is where the valve between the atrium and the ventricle closes.
Yeah.
Now then, obviously this valve has been pushed closed, and then the pressure is going to increase and increase and increase. And when can blood leave the ventricle?
When the pressure is greater in the ventricle than the aorta.
Which occurs here. So at that point, so between here and here, the valve is closed. Both the valves are closed. So the valve between the atrium and the ventricle is closed, and the valve between the ventricle and the aorta is closed, because blood can't be pushed out.
Okay.
It's only when the pressure is greater in the ventricle than in the aorta that blood can be expelled at that point, so the blood is passing from the ventricle into the aorta, which is why the pressure in the aorta then goes up. At that point, you've then got the aortic pressure goes up, and it stays up until the ventricle begins to relax. And the relaxation of the ventricle starts to occur here because the pressure no longer goes up. At that point, the pressure starts to fall in the ventricle until the pressure at this point becomes lower than in the aorta. So blood flows back from the aorta into the ventricle, which pushes the valve closed.
Yeah.
Between the aorta and the ventricle. So blood has flowed from the ventricle into the aorta because the ventricle has decreased in volume, increased in pressure, squeezed the blood into the aortic walls have expanded outwards, the ventricle stops contracting, begins to relax, at which point the pressure is greater in the aorta than in the ventricle, at which point the blood flows back from the aorta into the ventricle, and that pushes this valve closed. So then the pressure continues to decline, coming down here in the ventricle as the ventricle relaxes. So all the time the ventricle is relaxing, the pressure is falling, until you get to a point here where the pressure in the ventricle is now lower than the pressure in the atrium. So at that point, the valve between the atrium and the ventricle gets pushed open because the pressure is now greater in the atrium than the ventricle.
Yeah.
Then, now blood pressure here is greater in the atrium than in the ventricle, so this valve is open between the atrium and the ventricle, and then the pressure begins to increase because it's filling up with blood, and it keeps on increasing to here, and at that point this is atrial systole, which is the contraction of the atria to get the rest of the blood that might be in it pushed into the ventricle.
Okay.
And that's a heartbeat.